For a long time, Tim had been plagued by the same recurring nightmare. Robert Johnson, with a malicious grin, ripping apart the purchase contract, his laughter echoing ominously. Tim regretted ever getting involved with this shrewd and calculating retiree to buy an apartment. People had warned him about Robert Johnson's deceitful nature. Determined, Tim vowed that if he could reclaim justice and wrest the property from the clutches of the insolent senior, he would promptly sell it and buy an apartment in another neighborhood, ensuring he never had to deal with Robert Johnson again. Owning a spacious 3-bedroom apartment in New York City, even if not a fancy one, had been Tim's dream for years. To achieve this cherished desire, he had started working at 17, diligently saving every spare dollar. Nearly 11 years had passed as he painstakingly accumulated the required sum, aided by his parents' contributions, the sale of his grandmother's apartment in Los Angeles after her passing, and the money he'd set aside for his son's future. Tim approached the selection of real estate meticulously. He first identified the area he liked, thoroughly researching his favorites, choosing a suitable courtyard building, and posting flyers on each entrance door, declaring his intent to buy an apartment there. He opted not to use realtors, unwilling to part with a hefty commission fee. Though he received a few calls and attended viewings, Tim never finalized any purchases. Either the owners demanded exorbitant prices, or the apartments were in terrible condition despite being sold cheaply. Tim chose to be patient, confident he would eventually find his dream option, meanwhile continuing to rent and diligently saving for future renovations. 4 months prior, the young man received a call from a man introducing himself as Robert Johnson. "I have exactly what you're looking for, a cozy 2-bedroom apartment, well-maintained, and doesn't need major repairs." "Great, that's what I've been searching for. Should we discuss the price right away?" Timothy inquired. "Come see it first, check it out, and then we can negotiate," Robert Johnson suggested. Impressed by the apartment, Timothy found the owner's description to be accurate. "Your offer sounds good to me." "Robert Johnson, what's your asking price for the apartment?" Timothy inquired. "I'm asking $8.5 million, but for the right buyer, there's room for negotiation," Robert Johnson replied. Agreeing to reduce the price by $500,000, the retiree explained his urgency to sell. "I'm eager to move in with my son. The apartment is too big and expensive for me alone. I mostly use one room, leaving the others empty. I'll split the proceeds among my children, giving each $2.5 million, and I'll keep $500,000 for a decent funeral." Shaking hands, they parted ways, with Robert Johnson mentioning his gradual packing process, while Timothy vowed to initiate the transaction formalities. As Timothy exited the building, he was approached by an unfamiliar woman. "Excuse me, I saw you with Robert Johnson. Are you thinking about buying an apartment from him?" she inquired. Tim chuckled, responding, "Neighbors do have sharp eyes." "Yes, I'm in the process of buying. Everything's settled. I'm Tim, soon to be your neighbor." "Tim, be careful with Robert Johnson. He's a horrible man, no doubt about it. The trouble he's caused among his neighbors in the 15 years he's lived here. Deceitful, unscrupulous, and greedy. Keep a watchful eye on him," the woman warned before hurrying into the building. Tim resumed his activities, pondering the neighbor's harsh words about the apartment's former owner. Perhaps they had some unresolved conflict. Despite this, Robert Johnson had seemed pleasant enough to Tim. The transaction went smoothly, with Tim even hiring a lawyer to ensure everything was legal and hassle-free. According to the contract, Robert Johnson had to unregister within 30 days, giving Timothy a month for the former owner to move out. Tim didn't bother the retiree with small issues and tried to be flexible with Robert Johnson's minor requests. The retiree called frequently. "Tim, there's a leaky faucet in the bathroom. It needs replacing. I can manage for another 3 weeks, but how will I shower? Can you please take care of this?" You'll be using the bathroom soon enough." As the deadline approached, Tim grew increasingly frustrated with these requests. He ended up replacing outlets throughout the apartment, installing new faucets, and even patching up wallpaper in some areas, all on his own dime. Counting down the days until he could finally move in, Tim felt his patience wearing thin. So when Robert Johnson called him with another request, he was clearly annoyed. "Tim, how about we push back the move-out date another month? My son's still renovating the house, and the room isn't quite ready yet." "Surely you can wait a little longer," Robert Johnson asked. Trying to refuse, Tim reminded him of the terms clearly outlined in the contract. "Robert Johnson, I understand your situation, but we agreed on a month for you to vacate. I can't make exceptions. I've been paying extra for 2 months now, on top of having my own place to renovate." Persisting, Robert Johnson appealed to Tim's empathy. "Put yourself in my shoes, Tim. Imagine someone kicking your dad out on the street like this. The room isn't ready yet, but I'll pressure my son to speed things up. I promise, in exactly 1 month, I'll be out of your hair." Tim gave in one last time, stating firmly, "Robert Johnson, this is my final concession. In 30 days, I'll have a locksmith change the locks. Please make sure your belongings are out by then." Despite Robert Johnson's attempts to push for another extension, Tim firmly shut down these requests, explaining to the retiree that he couldn't afford to spend more time solving other people's problems. On the agreed-upon move-out date, Tim arrived at Robert Johnson's place as planned. As he entered, he couldn't hide his frustration upon seeing that none of the retiree's belongings had been moved, everything still in its usual spot. Anticipating yet another plea for an extension, Tim inquired, "Robert Johnson, why haven't you packed up yet? I don't see any suitcases. Did you already move everything to your son's place?" With a heavy sigh, Robert Johnson slumped onto the sofa and confessed, "Tim, I sold you the apartment, but I've changed my mind about moving out, even though I've cashed the check." Stunned, Tim protested, "What do you mean you won't move out? We had a deal. You got paid in full, and I even gave you an extension based on your story. You promised you wouldn't be here today." Wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, Robert Johnson began to explain tearfully, "You see, son, there's been a terrible turn of events. Remember I told you I wanted to move in with my son? Well, it turns out my son is homeless now. His wife kicked him out after catching him with another woman. I always said Valerka married the wrong woman. A smart one would have looked the other way, but she packed his bags and threw him out. She owns the house, you see? So now I'm stuck with nowhere to go, son." Baffled, Tim suggested, "But surely we can reverse the transaction. You can return my money, and I'll give you the apartment back." Robert Johnson shook his head sadly. "I can't do that. I've already divided the money among my kids. I gave each of my children $2.5 million. How can I take back a gift like that? I've been thinking, why don't we just share the place? You take one room, and I'll take another. It could be kind of fun. I've been on my own for a long time. I know how to run a household. You wouldn't have to worry about laundry, dishes, or cooking. You can hold off on getting married. I wouldn't recommend it anyway." "Marriage is hardly a bed of roses," Robert Johnson insisted. "Hold on a minute, Robert Johnson," Tim interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you proposing here? And forgive me for asking, but have you been drinking?" "No, completely sober. I don't touch alcohol," Robert Johnson replied earnestly. "But I truly have nowhere else to go, son. No options left. We can figure this out." Fuming mad, Tim couldn't hold back any longer. "You're a crook. That's why the neighbors warned me about you. You planned all along to cheat me, to keep both the money and the apartment. Listen closely. Let's settle this peacefully. I'm taking time off work and evicting you legally. That means cops and the courts, if necessary. Go ahead, son. Do whatever you gotta do. the retiree retorted with a malicious grin. The state protects seniors. They won't throw me out on the street. And if they try, I'll barricade myself in and refuse to leave. Besides, my offer doesn't sound that bad, does it? You're single, you might get lonely. Here, I can be your buddy and housekeeper. Feeling defeated and utterly drained, Tim reluctantly left his own apartment and walked out onto the street. On his way out, Tim ran into his neighbor, Susan Anderson, who noticed his obvious distress and quickly ushered him into her apartment, wanting to hear what happened. Tim poured out his heart to her, telling her the whole ordeal. "This is exactly the kind of scam I was afraid of," Susan Anderson exclaimed angrily. "You're not the first person Robert Johnson has tried to trick. I stopped others from buying his apartment, but you were pretty determined. You absolutely have to sue him. That's your only option. Don't believe a word Robert Johnson says. He might have mentioned kids, but his son is a drunk living in the village with his wife. The old man doesn't have any money. He probably gambled it all away at the slots. There's a hidden gambling den nearby, and Robert Johnson is a regular. If there's anything left, it's probably chump change. Don't fall for his story about having nowhere to go. His sister has been begging him to move in with her for years, but he refuses. Under her watch, he wouldn't be able to gamble away whatever money he has left." Empowered by Susan Anderson's advice, Tim immediately sought help from the local police officer. After checking the system, the officer confirmed, "The retiree is still registered in your apartment. Why didn't you follow through with a deregistration process? She gave you good advice. Take him to court. When the marshals come to enforce the eviction order, they'll get him out of there fast. I'll also let Robert Johnson's sister know. She'll be happy to hear the news." Robert Johnson refused to let Tim back into the apartment, determined to hold his ground. Tim grew worried, fearing his opponent might not even show up in court. However, to his surprise, Robert Johnson did attend the hearing, and a dramatic scene unfolded before the judge. "Your Honor," Robert Johnson began, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm a retiree, a former factory worker who gave 40 years of my life to this company. I earned this apartment through hard work and dedication. 6 years ago, I gifted the property to my daughter, with the condition that I could live here for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, my daughter passed away 5 years ago, and the law says the apartment automatically came back to me." He continued, "However, I still have the legal right to live in this apartment according to the paperwork. Your Honor, I'm not asking Tim to give up ownership. I just want to keep living here." Cutting him off, Tim addressed the defendant. "Robert Johnson, what happens if something were to happen to you? What if you, unfortunately, become unable to take care of yourself?" Unfazed, Robert Johnson exclaimed, "That's not a concern. We should take care of our seniors. When I pass away, Tim can do whatever he wants with the apartment. Your Honor, I trust you, unlike the plaintiff, to respect my age and not throw me out on the street. Where would I go? To a homeless shelter?" The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick as the judge considered the emotional plea from the elderly retiree. Following the court's decision against Robert Johnson, ordering his eviction from the apartment, Tim received a call from Robert Johnson's sister the day after the hearing. "I'm so sorry about my brother's behavior. This whole situation is awful. Please come over. I'll give you the keys. We'll be out of there in an hour. We've packed up the essentials, and you can toss out the rest. Again, I'm truly sorry." Instead of selling the apartment, Tim decided to renovate it. This turned out to be a good decision as he found joy in his new home. He even developed a connection with Susan Anderson's granddaughter, Veronica, who agreed to go to the movies with him. The whole ordeal with the apartment definitely brought about major changes in Tim's life. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more awesome stories in the future. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey, and we'll see you next video.